Okay, well, we'll kick this thing off right at 7 p.m., right on schedule. So I have the agenda up on the screen. It's really simple. I have a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to go over with you guys with. Then we'll jump right into the discussion. So everyone loves a little slideshow. So we had our first really big meeting a month ago with everyone who's in the budget and education working group, and now we're having our smaller group meetings. So we've already held 3. We've done the special needs, I've done the teacher pay and retention, and as well as the rural, and now we're in sustainability and tax burden. So I put you guys in this group because you kind of mentioned something that was along those lines, or you mentioned nothing and I randomly assigned you. But thank you so much for joining in this small group. And I don't think this needs to be said, but everyone be respectful of each other. We're all here for the right reasons, and we may have different opinions on things, and we may have the same goal, but a different path to get there. But like I said, we're all here for the right reasons. So the housekeeping items that I wanted to kind of start talking about and is the accessing the share drive. So I created a share folder for your group. You should have received a link for that in the email. And quickly, let me apologize for the broken Zoom link. I apologize. I copied 2 things together and it went in there. So a copy and paste error on my part. But so in the share drive, you're going to see 2 documents as of now. One is a group member list. So as long as no one has any objections, what I am going to do is share the names and the email addresses of everyone that's in the small group with each other. So that way, if you really you're connect with someone and you're like, oh yeah, I really want to talk about that more, you can reach out to them or share any information. The other thing is, and I'll bring it up here. So you guys are group D. The group members already talked about. This is the resource link. So I started throwing some links in here, but this is really an open share type of thing. So if you guys think of any or see any articles or research or anything like that, throw that in there so people can check it out. I have a couple in here. I threw one in here particularly for this group, revenue committee. So they're looking at property tax modernization right now. So that's just something that the interim committee of the revenue committee is actually discussing at the moment. So I thought that was very pertinent to our discussions here. So do not be shy about throwing stuff in there. As long as it's appropriate, like share it with the group. So share drive, and then today, kind of what are our goals today? So one of the biggest things I want to do is specifically start to identify the problems that you guys see in your community. Every community in Montana is a little bit different, and we have a really broad constituent. So the last group I was talking to was the rural group. One of the things I like to mention is Montana has the most one-room schoolhouses left in the country. Nebraska's number 2. And then we have big districts like Billings. So the needs are very different. So I want to start identifying the problems that you guys see in your district or what hurdles, and then start to narrow down where we should start to look for solutions. And that discussion will continue into our other meetings. One of the biggest things I want to reiterate is think outside the box and be creative. We could look at other states for inspiration of what they do, but also it doesn't have to be done anywhere. If you think of something, like we can put that down into paper and hopefully send this over to the legislature, and they'll see a lot of fun, creative ideas. We want to create a buffet of ideas for them to look at. And the last thing I want to say is that we don't have to stay on topic. All of this stuff intertwines completely. So even if you feel like something's maybe a little bit off base, like let's go down that rabbit hole. We never know where it may lead. And then I just wanted to quickly highlight the next meeting. So the next meeting is Tuesday, June 25th. So we have, June 25th. Whew, I almost forgot what month it was. So that's just something to look forward to. And now I'm going to stop my screen share so we can start a discussion. And what I would really love for people to just go around really quickly, just your name and kind of like one line of why you wanted to be a part of this group or something that you're looking to learn more or express. So just quickly. And I would love, does someone want to just kick it off? Just quickly, one line introduction.
I'll go first.
I will. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
All right, sorry. My name is Lisa Verlanik Fowler. I've been a school teacher in Florence for 30 years. I'm actually running for the legislature, and I'm worried about the future of our schools and funding. In Florence, we can't pass a levy to save our lives, and I'm worried about the tax base. When they look at their tax bill and it's 75% of their taxes go to local schools, they're not going to pass anything else, and we're really struggling. So that's why I'm here.
Okay, I'll go next. I'm Gary Lucene. I'm a Bozeman School trustee, been on the board 19 years. Been through, also served on the MTSBA board for 13 years, got off that a year ago. And we have very similar issues that Lisa just expressed on tax burden with taxpayers, recruitment and retention issues. In our area, we've got cost of living issues, which the funding formula really does not account for on many of those things. Plus, there's many internal issues within our schools and in our buildings, behavioral issues, social emotional issues, teacher workload, overworkload, administrative overworkload, all kinds of things that need to be reviewed and accounted for. And part of the solution to that is our education system has to be appropriately funded if we want to provide a quality education to our students.
Great, thanks, Gary. Who would like to be next?
I can. This is Sarah. And sorry, I'm at a band concert for the first like 10 or 15 minutes of this. So I don't have my camera on. I'll turn it on once the freshman band's done. But I'm a teacher at Capitol High in Helena, and I pretty much can just mirror everything that was just said. From funding to work conditions to, being a veteran teacher. I'm concerned that we're not going to be able to recruit anyone to be in our public schools with the lack of funding.
Becky, would you like to say hi?
Sure, yeah. My name is Becky Krogan. I'm a teacher out in Belgrade. We are obviously facing the exact same problems. One of the tricky things we have is we are a AA district that is right 8 miles down the road from another AA district, but our tax bases are very different. So we lose a lot of our teachers to our neighbor down the road because they have a little bit higher wages, and so it's putting a burden on our staff to have a huge turnover of our teachers and not being able to retain any of our quality teachers in Belgrade, and we lose them, and we have very few people on the top end of our salary matrix and a lot of people on the bottom end and nobody in the middle. So we're struggling in that regard.
I'm retired educator. Can you hear me?
I think we can now.
I would express the same views as everyone else has expressed. It's my concern is that the negative relationship that's building between schools and their communities. It's Montana schools are very important to the survival and success of our communities. If we lose that, we're talking about a culture that will be gone. I mean, it truly is one of the last best places in this country, and I would hate to see that go by the wayside. It's a shame.
I'm Christina. I actually am not a facilitator of education here. I have 3 kids who I actually take to private school because the public education was not good. And I mean, no disrespect, teachers work very hard. I used to teach myself at a private university doing culinary arts and restaurant management, and I get the difficulty of it. I'm here because if I can come up with out of the box ideas to help in any way with the public schools. Although my kids are not in public school, I am here to try and help with those ideas, because I would love for my kids to go to public school. It would save a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of hassle, but my kids are worth not having to go specifically where we're at, rurally to the school out here. It had nothing to do with the teachers at all. It had to do with certain administration that mistreated my child in kindergarten. And it was unacceptable behavior and nothing had been dealt with. And so I was left with no choice but to drive 3 hours every day to take them to private school. All three are now in private school. And that's what I'm here to fix, because I know there's a lot of parents like me who do not have the ability or means or whatever to be able to make those choices for their families. And I actually would rather they not have to. So if I can help with ideas and fixing it so that our kids remain in public school, not only my own to go back, but also others to stay and to find some kind of middle ground on the problems that there are, then that's why I'm here.
Great. I see 3 mics on my screen. Would one of the mics like to say hi?
Yeah, this is Mike Thompson. I think I probably am all 3 that are on your screen. I've got 56 years in education. Some of it in Montana, but 33 years of it working for the Department of Defense schools overseas. I've worked in every job in a school, from substitute teacher to district superintendent in districts that included all of southeastern Germany and the islands of Okinawa and Guam in the Pacific. So I've seen quite a bit. I see different funding. I worked on a different funding model than you do, but I'm really disturbed when I pick up a newspaper or an article and it says 50 teachers laid off in Helena, and people talking about cutting programs. We have to look at something that's going to adequately fund and adequately compensate our teachers that we're going to have.
Great. Anyone else? Do you want to say hi real quick? I'm not sure who we're missing. Anyone else want?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
This
there
is Hannah Warhank. I am a parent in Helena, and I am from a small rural town in Montana and went to public education there. My mom was a teacher for 40 some years. And I am the president of an organization we started here in Helena called Friends of Neighborhood Schools, because due to our budget issues, there's a lot of cuts on the table, and we are concerned that those cuts will include consolidating elementary schools and packing the classrooms too large. And so we are advocating for the importance of neighborhood schools.
Great. Well, last call for anyone who wants to say hi. You don't also have to say hi. So one of the things that I wanted to focus on today, and we started to get into that with everyone's introductions, is addressing the specific challenges you see in the district. And I heard teacher attention a lot, and we actually have a group on teacher attention. That doesn't mean we can't talk about it here. We definitely should, especially how we could, if the solution is, I'm just doing a lot of ifs, to raise teacher salaries, where do we get that funding from? And this group is specifically set up to try to address not only the funding shortfalls, but making sure that our communities, people can afford to live in the communities that they want to send their kids to, right? So that sustainability aspect is really important. Something I've mentioned in previous groups is that Montana has a surplus right now. That doesn't mean we'll have a surplus in 5 years. So we want to make sure that the things that we're looking at and that we can hopefully propose to the legislature that they'll take very seriously are things that have long-term positive impacts. And there's people on here that I think we have a lot of representation from some of the larger schools, but some of the rural schools too. The last group, and Christina was in our last group, was focusing on rural. We want to make sure that we're looking at all of our school districts comprehensively. Like I mentioned, Montana has the most one-room schoolhouses, but then we have some large school districts too. So I don't want to talk that much. I want you guys to talk. I'm going to be taking notes. I'm also recording this meeting. But like I said, let's start to address or start to identify some of the specific issues we'd like to look at, whether big picture or small picture. When we're looking at teacher retention, we could talk about something we've talked about in other groups. Some type of thing to help with the housing issue, whether that's just the expense of housing or just the lack of housing in some areas. But we can talk about big picture too of how we can adjust the funding formula in ways that would give school districts more funds to help pay for teacher salaries or benefits or whatever that may be. So I want to turn it over to you guys. I want to do a lot of notes and listening, but really try to start to organize where we see the biggest issues. So would someone like to take the first bite of the apple and kick us off?
I'll start off. This is Gary. I think there's the current funding formula we have is the difficulty it has to be applied to the wide diversity of our schools around our state. And I don't think that works very well. So I thought of this a few years ago of having possibly 4 different funding formulas. It'd be AA, A, B, and C funding formula. So those schools and those different levels would have appropriate funding to address the needs in their communities. It could be a AA funding formula, an A formula, and a BC formula. I don't know what would work, but I think the diversity of our schools and our population requires a diversity in our funding formula to really adequately fund it, and that could take into account the taxpayer level in each community and kind of work through that. So that's just one thought.
This is Mike. I think what Gary brought up is kind of an important first step as you look at this. We've got a funding formula that's basically population based, and every school has got to have certain things. I think you have to have a formula that includes both population and programmatic based funding to provide a quality education across the board, regardless of whether I'm in Roy, Montana, or if I'm in Kalispell. I think we aren't going to get a one size fits all solution to this.
No, I agree. And I think, oh, it's just me echoing. I think looking at a different, like almost a different tiered system is a great and creative way to look at it. And then obviously there are currently different grants and stuff that schools can get depending on their need, whether they're like a Title I school or there's rural school grants. Is that something you guys think could also be maybe augmented way? So if they're not looking at a full formula, and that's one of the things, I want to have a buffet of options. So if the legislature doesn't tackle completely reconfiguring the formula, is there other ways that you think that maybe a grant system, not a full block grant system or anything, or I guess it could be, but I'm just throwing ideas out there. Are other programs like that, do you think those are very helpful to schools?
This is Godfrey. I think they're helpful, but the problem you run into is that because the way that those grants are written, many of them hamstring a district's ability to, they don't get the flexibility to use them in ways that would be beneficial, that offers them the most benefit. So I think that's a big issue with that.
Well, I think that's a lesson too we can learn from some of the ESSER funds, right? So the ESSER funds had a lot of flexibility in them. So schools had a huge leeway in how they use those funds. Those were emergency COVID spending measures, but that doesn't mean we can't look at how that funding was set up Because I do think flexibility, especially in a state as diverse as Montana and the needs as diverse as Montana, having flexibility in funding or in certain areas may be very beneficial.
I would try.
Oh,
Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
I'm so sorry. Just my experience in Florence, we have, I mean, I know we have a population that struggles financially, but we don't get parents to fill out the applications, for free and reduced lunch, which our Title I funds are tied to. And also, I mean, just because a kid may be socioeconomic, not as high as somebody else, that doesn't mean that their kids still have learning problems, right? I mean, they may be a high socioeconomic category, but some of those kids still have learning issues. And I have big concerns about how that's funded with a grant. I mean, we certainly like the ESSER funds, how they were, but the ESSER cliff we all talk about. Now we're really struggling to, we've used those ESSER dollars. Now they're not available to us. And the learning losses are still there. I taught through COVID. I mean, even in my first grade class, I think we're still dealing with the effects of COVID now. And so having a broader scope for grants would be great and not tied to parents filling out an application and their finances.
And I know some of that is federally required things, so not everything we can address maybe here in Montana, but that doesn't mean it's not an important thing to raise, because one of the things I've heard throughout is also the administrative burden that's put on schools. And I know some of that, we're trying to streamline here with everything being digital, but it's still, there's still growing pains, and there's still ways that I think, like, sometimes when DC passed the law, they may have really good intentions, but they don't realize that all the strings that come along with it create such an administrative burden on the school.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, the title of this committee is sustainability. I think that's really what we need to focus on. We need to have a funding formula that is stable. So every district can count on dollars to fund what they need to fund in the classroom and in the buildings to their best ability. And if there's grants available after that, that would be great. But I think the ESSER funding is a very good example of a situation that those one-time monies or grants that could expire provide money for a period of time, but it's not sustainable. So I think any funding formula has to be sustainable and meet the needs of every school in our state to do what they need to do and remove a lot of the workload, the burden, and allow our teachers and administrators to refocus on educating our kids. So I think
Yeah.
is
To piggyback on what Gary said, I mean, this is tax burden and sustainability. And I agree. I mean, with the funding formula the way it is right now, it isn't sustainable for communities to fund their schools. And so they have to run levies, which increases taxes. And you can see in Helena, all 5 of our levies went down this year. Usually we have a 30% turnout for those elections. We had 56%. People really turned out to vote against them because they're upset that their taxes went up this year. And they think that those dollars are going to education, but they just simply aren't. And so that's the problem. There's this giant surplus in the state level, and there's schools that are struggling to stay open and laying off 50 teachers because they simply, might have to cut PE and music throughout the district. And that just seems really unfair to people that saw a drastic property tax increase and didn't want to fund the levy with levies, but also think that the education in their community should be funded.
So I agree with Hannah. I totally understand where she's coming from, because it's the same. Like, I have kids in private school, but I pay property taxes. Those taxes go to a school, to an administrator that I feel like shouldn't even be working there. So what I had suggested, a few things in the last meeting, was that I think the wrong people are being taxed. If you have a teacher making $40,000 a year, who lives in an area where the expense of living far surpasses their income, and let's say they don't have the luxury of 2 incomes, I did the calculation. If you want a single studio apartment in Helena, Montana, you're paying $1,800 a month. That is the full entire month's income of a teacher making $40,000 a year. And then if the apartment gets higher property taxes, their rent is going to go up because they have to pay the additional property taxes. So the wrong people are being taxed. What I had suggested in the last meeting is that we have, in the area that I live outside of Helena in a small rural town, and the houses out here, my house is minimal and it's worth over $500,000. The houses around here that I'm looking at out my window are $1.2 million, and they don't live there. They don't live there. They're some of them are people who live in the state and have a second home. Some of them are people who live out of state and this is their second home. So one of the suggestions I made was that the people who live out of state, who enjoy the luxury of Montana, whether that be the millionaires and billionaires in Big Sky or the people who have second homes here, should have to take on some of that burden, because when they go out to restaurants or they go out to do the fun, entertaining things, fly fishing, etc., the people who are paying the price actually live here. So because they're purchasing their properties, which are skyrocketing the properties, making it completely unaffordable for people who actually live and work here and have children here and are trying to thrive here, I think that that tax burden should be put on them. I think that the people who live in those areas who are out-of-staters should have an additional tax. I think that the wrong areas of schooling are cut, music, PE, those kinds of things. I think that we had talked about in the last meeting is the bus drivers. I love bus drivers. I rode with bus drivers my whole life going to school. They're great. However, in Helena, Montana, they're offering a $4,000 incentive for these bus drivers just to sign into work for a split shift of 4 hours a day. I drive my kids 3 hours every single day to go to school. I said this in the last meeting. I'm not trying to be callous, but if I can do it, other parents can do it. Why not take the budget from the maintenance of the vehicles, the cost of the buses, the cost of paying the bus drivers, the $4,000 bonuses, and give an incentive to parents to drive their own children to school? And those are just some thoughts I had.
Okay, I'll say that I think that Idaho does something similar to the tax structure. If you're looking for an example, I'm pretty sure that Idaho does tax second properties different than first properties. So they may be a state to look at in terms of that. Transportation, I think some is federally required. So I think that's going to be from my standpoint, a hard ask in terms of transportation. One of the things I'd like to see is taking some of the funding sources that are already established and to see us maximize those, because I think there are some sources like state lands that we are not taking as much money in on our state land leases that were set up for education as we should be. We have my husband, I'm in Helena, but my husband grew up in Opine, Montana. So we're kind of familiar with some of the rural urban problems. But like at his farm, his state land leases, that what he has to pay for those is a fraction of the market value that the land right next door is getting from a private lease. And so I think that in some ways we're subsidizing big ag for our state land leases. So I would like to see something that requires those land leases to be at market value. Some of you probably know the budget better than me. I've tried to self-educate by going to as many things in Helena as I can. And there was someone from Legislative Services who was saying that that's maybe 5% of our budget for schools, but it's not capped the same way that other, as our property taxes goes and they slide and schools aren't seeing funding. And maybe someone can correct me, my understanding was that money isn't, that all that money stays with schools. And so if we can, take that money that's already, and maybe the group has some other ideas, but things that are already supposed to be paying for education and really leverage those to get more money available for schools as well.
And I know, Christina, you've already heard me say this, but I do know that there are individuals in the legislature that are looking at right now taxing that second home for out-of-staters at a different tax rate. So
right, I remember
back to that being that is just for everyone's awareness. I know that is something that they're looking at. So there is an appetite for that, at least from some. And looking at the state land leases, I think is a great idea. And I think there's a number of funding that comes in that, and I know for one of the other groups, I'm going to be pulling some more information because I didn't have it at the tips of my fingertips. But we also get funding from like lumber, right, and oil and all of that. So those are all things that we need to look at of how they're coming in. Also, I mentioned this in the last meeting too, the pot money with all the dispensaries opening up. So some of that is sorry. Some of that can be, we can look at how that's being directed. And we do have a surplus right now, but talking about sustainability, where are the and it's going to be a mosaic, right? Because sometimes there could be years where things do dip and you don't get as much money from other things. But I think that's important that we look at multiple funding sources, so that if something does dip, we don't end up in an emergency situation.
Kristen, I was just going to say, you know, running for the legislature here in Missoula, that you have the right idea. I mean, I feel like first home, I mean, we have people that can't pay their taxes. They've gone up just like Helena. You know, they're choosing between, you know, their pills and their, you know, property taxes. It's gone up so much. You know, taxing our a primary resident at a different rate. So I think that's a really great idea. And obviously, if I get elected, I would support that. There was something else, though. Now it's escaped my brain. I wrote it down. Oh, the lumber, because we've had 2 mills shut down, lumber mills shut down recently in the Missoula area. And so, you know, here's 2 sources that we got a lot of our tax money from in this area, and now they're shut down. And, you know, those things are really concerning. So, and I don't know, you know, where we can recoup funds other places, but to think about something in that area.
Yeah, I think that, right, that's exactly part of the sustainability, that you can't rely on one source of funding. If property values dip again, right, that makes a change in everything. So one of the, like I said, one of the resources I threw into the oh my God, I'm so sorry. I I threw into the share doc was that what the revenue. So the revenue committee right now is looking at property taxes and reconfiguring that. And obviously that has a direct kind of effect, and it goes hand in hand with how we're looking at school funding as well. So I do think I can keep us updated as the months go by of kind of what the revenue committee is looking at, but they did have a pretty big hearing just recently looking at some of this stuff.
Katie, I have a question on, do you know what the state gets for gas tax?
I don't know the gas tax number off the top of my head. I don't. But I can definitely pull that for you.
Is that, I mean, that may be a source possibly that could provide some stable funding for education.
And you mean a gas tax like the gas tax at a pump, or like the tax on, okay, just
Yes.
making sure.
Yes.
Because like Wyoming does a lot of their education funding from the oil that they source. So we don't, in Montana, don't do quite as much of that. So Wyoming does have a large source of their education funding coming from that area.
Well, yeah, I think Wyoming gets it from oil production.
Yes. Yeah, that's what, yeah.
So this would be at the pump. You know, there's federal tax, state tax on gas, and with people visiting the state, driving through the state, all that, you know, we could capture some money from those individuals, which is kind of a diversion of a sales tax, so to speak, but maybe an option.
Just
You're on mute.
I checked the gas tax and it's 32.5 cents a gallon. Now,
that is relatively high compared to some other states. That doesn't mean it's not something that we could propose, but just keeping in mind like the appetite of the legislature to add on to a gas tax that's higher than some other states. So like my sister lives in New Jersey, that's a higher gas tax than actually New Jersey.
Well, I don't know where the gas tax money goes.
Yeah,
So-
no, I'll check that for you.
Yeah, we could leave the 32 cents the same, but where it's directed to may change.
So can I ask another question? One of the things that I think that is lacking in our funding formula is money for buildings. That the funding formula seems to take this per capita or per pupil and all these other things. But when we look at what it takes to maintain and build buildings, that's almost always seems to be bonded, right? And I think our school district, you look at when we haven't been able to keep up with inflation, and you look at the how like we've been saying, we're not our budgets aren't growing, but things are more expensive. So when I look at my school district, they have to keep the lights on, right? There's like X, Y, and Z things they have to do, and they're spending more of their budget on those things, which means that staff and like salaries across the board in every position, whether it be a para or whether it be whatever, there is not the ability to grow those to keep up with anything, if that makes sense. So I don't know, the funding formula, when I asked the guy from legislative services, it seemed to be that, yeah, we're not necessarily at a state level funding some of those things. And we found out during COVID that having school buildings is important. If we don't have school buildings, our educational system doesn't work. And it doesn't seem like we're getting the funding for our buildings and what we need to keep up with those. And when that's not happening, then all these other things that are, you know, where do you cut money? You can't cut it by turning the lights off or the heat off. You cut it by cutting the teachers, and you cut it by cutting music programs, and you cut it by cutting all these things that are not state mandated, right? Like, and so I don't know, just trying to think about that, if there's a creative way to work that into a formula somewhere, or take parts of things so that the top of the money doesn't go back to the state general fund and it's actually used for some of these things that could relieve the burden on schools, right? If we had more money for maintenance, if we had more money for new buildings, because our buildings won't last forever. And that's, I think, once again, that goes like with levies and bonds, to maybe not have a new, but maybe a shift of funding from something. And no one seems to know whether this surplus, like you said, is going to be here. Are there projections? I mean, do they have projections on that? I guess there's a lot of questions in those statements. So I'm hoping someone else who maybe knows more than I do could like talk through some of these things. Like I mean, maybe the funding formula and the buildings and the upkeep and some of those things. And
Well, I think I have a few things maybe for people to chew on or ponder. One is, well, I mean, we have a surplus because the economy was, although inflation hurt, the economy was still doing okay enough for them to bring in enough tax dollars, right? So if the economy takes a much worse dive in any way, who knows where funding could be, or yeah. So that's why like you never can't take surpluses for granted. One of the things that popped into my mind is having like a flexibility of maybe more flexibility in the building fund. And I have to, like I said, I'm not an expert in any of this, but maybe looking at ways where that type of fund can roll over more or last longer, be more sustainable, not so that like, well, I'm trying to think, and maybe someone knows here. I think it might have been Scobie, but it might have been another school district I ran with S, and I'm just blanking, and Scobie's in my brain because I talked to someone from Scobie today, but their roof just blew off like a couple weeks ago during to windstorms. So that was probably an expense that they were not planning for. But maybe if there's a way we could give more flexibility to that funding and let them hold on, let schools hold on to some of that funding for longer for those rainy day situations. That's all how we do our budgets at home, right? We try to have some type of cushion if there's something, if our car breaks down, right? So maybe there's ways that we can look at that fund, not only what funds go into it, but how the schools can use those funds, how they can maintain those funds maybe throughout years.
There's a building reserve. This is Godfrey. That's usually a building reserve levy fund for things like that. And there limits that. So
I'm
that, but
sorry,
it's still a levy that have to run.
you were breaking up quite a bit.
And those are usually handled building reserve levies. Did you hear that?
Oh, yeah, I did hear that. Yeah. Right, if we're looking at both, I guess I was saying if
But
we're
it's
looking
still
at
a
getting
levy.
away from some of those levies, and I know there is a building reserve fund, but I'm talking, maybe we could look at ways to make that more flexible, or maybe there's another funding stream that can go into that.
I think just historically and stuff I've dealt with, I think that the failure to maintain buildings and to put things off, we can fix it next year, we're good this year, and looking more at deferred maintenance ends up costing us a lot more in the long run, because that's when we find out we're going to be replacing a building that maybe had it been properly maintained and regularly maintained, I think we'd find it giving us much more service. I think that we've got to be careful, robbing Peter to pay Paul in some of these fund sources.
Good point. I've got a question. What happens with the coal tax funds?
What I heard, what happens to, and then I didn't hear the second part.
The coal tax
Coal tax.
funds?
So some of that does go to education, and I know I have a spreadsheet that does a breakdown of like coal, lumber, oil, and I can share that into the shared document, but I do know we do have a breakdown of that. But I don't want to speak incorrectly, so I don't want to say anything of what I remember off the top of my head, but I do have that information that I can provide.
There was a study done maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago for the state on just maintenance of school buildings around the state. And the total at that time was, I think, right around $400 million, maybe a little under that. So that's one issue we have to deal with is and I know there's legislators that are very hesitant to just add more money to schools, period. But just that alone, roughly a $400 million expense.
And I know this was mentioned to someone before, but it was something that I think I heard some anecdotal stories of schools using ESSER funding to maybe upgrade some facilities, but then not having the money to maintain what they upgraded.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to make sure, like, I think like someone mentioned that when we're doing that investment, it makes sense that we can also maintain that investment going forward and have the funds or the resources to maintain it. Right? If we don't change the oil in our car, we're going to be in a lot worse shape than paying for that oil change. I'm using multiple car analogies today.
Mm-hmm.
But they're kind of in the situation where they can't afford not only to maintain the car by putting oil changes in it, they can't buy gas at this point. I mean, it's like the Montana Constitution guarantees free public education to kids. It's a quality education. And I think we're at the emergency now where that simply is coming to the point where it just can't happen in a lot of schools. And so, I know that there was that study a while ago, and I would say it's probably triple that now. Helena has $100 million of deferred maintenance in their buildings. But they can't even run a bond because they need to run levies because they can't fund simple education anymore. And so while I think it's useful to talk about other places that we can find a few dimes here or there, I think the bottom line is the funding formula is not working anymore. And it is a constitutional violation at this point if something doesn't happen to change it.
Well, we can get into that bigger picture thing. So there's obviously a lot of pieces that go into the funding formula. I'll just bring this one up because I talked about it recently, but the GTB, right, the guaranteed tax base, and how that's determined. That's something that obviously can be looked at. And I know Gary brought up the 4 different funding formulas, but do you guys see any other specific weaknesses in the funding formula where, we could obviously start from scratch. There's other states you can look at, but if there are other things you could say, like, that's an area where I see the biggest concern.
The inflationary cap seems a little low. It doesn't track with regular inflation, and inflation has gone way above the cap lately. And so that's a pretty significant issue, I would say.
And I'm concerned about that.
I agree with her. That's,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
No, you can go, and then I'll go.
I was just gonna say, like, that's across the board. That it's not even just for teachers. I worked at a elderly community as the executive chef, and the inflationary yearly increase that they would give staff members was like 1 or 2%. Well, when it's, under current things now, when it's 8% inflation, 10% inflation, depending on if it's groceries or gas or whatever the case may be, how can you sustain that? Nobody can sustain that. I had a sous chef who lived in his car during the week and then would travel to Conrad 3 hours away where his wife and stepkids lived, to sleep in his own bed. There has to be some kind of mediation of a middle balance somewhere for everybody, because we can't keep going at this. What if next year the inflation's at 10% and the increase is still only at 2? Then what? And the following year it's 12% and it's still only at 2.
So would you guys, I would say overall, this sounds like everyone's on the same page with this. Is this something that you think we should tie, I guess, scrap the inflation cap and tie it to actual inflation?
So can you clarify a question about the inflationary cap? Because it's always been this 3% number, right? That the superintendent of public instruction can give a 3%, can recommend up to a 3%, correct? And when I asked the legislative, they can ask the legislature for up to 3%. When I asked the legislative service, he said she can ask for that. However, the legislature could give more if they chose to. And they haven't they have not made that decision. So they said she can ask to 3%. She's capped at that. But the legislature has the choice to give more than that. Is that an accurate statement or not?
Yeah, as far as OPI is, like, at the end of the day, OPI just implements what the legislature passes. There's not much like leeway of like what OPI actually controls, if that makes sense. We implement what the legislature passes. So the cap is, it's not, like you said, it's not in the Constitution. It's not in there's not a federal law superseding it. So yes, the legislature could technically do whatever they want.
Right. So I'm concerned because Melissa Romano from Helena had a bill to be 4%, and that did not go last time, that the legislature already has the ability to increase inflationary spending, and they have chosen not to, even when, I mean, you can argue what inflation is, but it's been high, right? It's been above 3%. And so they have not chosen to do that in the last sessions. The other thing I'm concerned about is this 10-year look at the funding formula, that they're required to look at it every 10 years, but there's nothing to say they can't do it at 8. So I listened to some of the interim committee meetings, and they are talking about, well, in the next 2 years from now, they don't have to wait 2 years from now. They can start solving this now. It's a 10-year that they have to, but they can do it at 8. So they could look at a big overhaul this legislative session, but none of them were. And I was concerned about them talking about how the funding formula is not broken. So one of the things I'm concerned about is how do we, I feel like this group is pretty much saying we have problems, but how do you get legislators to understand that there are problems, and the people in the schools and the parents and the students are all suffering from this when we're not changing things. And no matter how many ideas we put on the table, that they're ignored. And I feel like often the people who are involved are people who are in the schools, and the community's mad. The community is paying so much, they're paying taxes, they want good schools, but I feel like there's a disconnect between a lot of that. So like, how do you get the legislature to take any of the ideas we bring forward and to act on them, as opposed to say those were recommendations, if that makes sense? Like, how do you get that priority there?
Well, I can't do anything. No, but so in my experience, just in my background has been working with legislatures, and I worked on in DC on the Hill too. Sometimes things don't happen overnight. Sometimes they don't happen in 5 years. That being said, I do think it's really important to put creative ideas out there, whether they're big picture. So I know right now we're talking very big picture, but that's why I also talk about some of the smaller things, because sometimes at the end of the day, it's still change. And sometimes big change doesn't happen overnight, but putting the ideas out there starts the conversation. And sometimes it doesn't work out in the first session, but sometimes some of the issues that were raised, you figure out ways to address it for the next session. And I know that's not perfect, but I do think there is a huge value to putting ideas out there. Just in my previous life, there was things that I saw introduced that I was like, this has no chance of passing. And then 5 years later, there was an appetite for it to pass, because we found different ways to maneuver it, address the concerns that people had, and get it passed. So I went from thinking there was no hope to seeing a bill signed into law. And it doesn't happen overnight, and everyone would like things to work faster. But I do think there's a huge value of putting ideas out there and then having a buffet of ideas. Maybe, and I'm just speculating, maybe they don't take on a full funding formula overhaul, but maybe there are some ideas that come out of this group that are a little bit more like bite-sized chunks that they can handle, and that they do pass in a more timely manner. But I think there's a huge benefit to having the discussion, bringing those ideas to them so they can have that discussion. And there's legislators all the time looking for creative solutions. The other thing I would mention is that, when we're talking about funding things, we have to find places to take that money, get that money from. And if we talk about a gas tax, maybe a 1 cent raise on the gas tax, like that is still taxes being increased on people. So there's always that, no matter what, the money's coming from somewhere. So
don't
there's
raise
always,
taxes on us. Don't. Not
like,
I swear to God. I swear to God.
But I'm just saying, like, when we're looking at anything, even if we're not directly taxing someone and you're taking money from somewhere, like there's ripple repercussions. So there's just like a lot of things at play, obviously.
I think what you just said, Katie, is totally accurate. I've been involved in every legislative session since 1987. And there are things where it's very beneficial to at least expose great ideas or innovative ideas to legislators and keep doing that, but also identify little chunks of things that they might buy into that could help the funding formula. So I'm going to offer one. In 20-9-309, which is the definition of basic system of free quality public elementary and secondary schools. One thing that's not in there that every district has to fund out of their general fund is activities. So it's athletics, speech and debate, those type of things. So, which are very important to every school. But that funding those comes out of the general fund for that district. So if the legislature would consider adding that to 20-9-309 as one of the basic provisions of a free quality public education, then they would have to fund that. How they fund that, that's the big question. There has to be money from somewhere to fund anything we're going to do.
But, there was a pretty historic tax increase that hit all of us this year. And I haven't really seen a good explanation. I mean, I get that we're saying there might not be a surplus in the future, but right now there is. And it was a really huge tax increase that hit every Montanan. And so I think that, there already has been a tax increase. Now we just need to get those dollars into education.
And that tax increase didn't have to go the way it went. It could have been, that tax increase could have been diverted, but it was not.
I also think it's important to recognize that it wasn't a tax increase on everyone, that it was a tax redistribution. So there were certain populations that didn't see a tax increase, whereas homeowners did. So I don't think it didn't increase school funding at all. And I think that was a misunderstanding by a lot of community members because our school funding is complicated. And we're trying to pass levies and they're seeing their taxes go up. They say, well, where's all that money going? I think it wasn't a tax increase. Like there's not more taxes at the state level, not more money at the state level. It was a tax redistribution.
I mean,
So
absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
So in the kitchen, because again, that's my area of expertise, and people often don't think it applies, but it actually applies to a lot. So there's a saying, too many hands in the pot. Bear with me. So my kids, I try to teach them to cook because I think it's a valuable trait and skill to have. So I have 3. They all want to help me cook. And I say, too many hands in the pot. So the other day, I've been trying to get them to express when they do not understand the words I'm using or the expressions I'm saying. So they said, Mommy, what does too many hands in the pot mean? So I put on a pot on the stove. The burner was not on. CPS, the burner was not on. So I said, okay, my hands are in the pot. That looks like there's enough room to work, right? And they said, yes, Mommy. And I said, okay, now you put your hands in the pot. They put their hands in the pot. And by the time all was done, all 4 of us had our hands in the pot. And I said, is there enough room to work? And they said, no. And I said, okay, so that's why I only have one of you interact in the cooking process at a time, because it's too many hands in the pot. What I heard in the last meeting and what I've heard in this meeting, it seems to be, I just, and this could be me being naive, I don't see why so many hands are in the pot, why things can't be simplified. I heard people say, we have to apply this and go here and hit that and type out this and fill out this form for grants and federal government. I mean, I think from my understanding, Montana is a sovereign state. So why do we have to have so much federal government influence? And why do all these teachers have to fill out all this paperwork for every little tiny thing? And why do superintendents have to go through all these loopholes for every little, I mean, that seems to me like a lot of administrative paid people in the middle who really have nothing to do. And by the way, corporate America is the same way. If you want somebody to get a raise, I had to go through 57 people to get one person that's a housekeeper a raise. So I get it on that level. Why? Like, how many of those salaries are essentially useless salaries mediating the in between from this person who needs the thing and this person who can give the thing? How many of those salaries could be non-existent and that fund be divvied out to the schools that need it?
Well, you get into a whole new can of worms there, but I mean, so a lot of this is well-meaning, right? So the federal government will give you money if your state and these schools are doing X, Y, and Z. And they're trying to incentivize certain behaviors by giving money with those strings attached. And then a lot of the reporting requirements at the state level, they're tracking. We want data all the time, right? There's lots of data coming in. So you want to track everything. But a lot of it is legislatively required on the state and on the federal level. And I'll give people the benefit of the doubt. I think most people are well-meaning when they create this program, but like I said, another one, they don't realize that all the strings that come with it. And there's obviously proposals on the federal level to just block grant that money back to the states where they don't have to do the list of A to Z to get the money. It's just block granted back to them. There's people who have proposed that, and that kind of gets to what you're saying, like, here's the chunk of money without all the strings attached. But then taxpayers also want to make sure there's accountability, right? So reporting where the money's going. So there's just so many little pieces that go into that. I would be happy to have less things for OPI to have to collect from all the schools, that then when we're the pass through, basically. We take all the data and then put the specific reports back to the federal government that they need to make sure that we get whatever grant, whatever money that's coming into the state. So, but I understand where you're coming from on that.
And I do, I understand where you're coming from as well, because being in, you know, on a top level of that as well, like for the ease of it and the stress of it, I didn't understand why, like, seeing this person every day and seeing how hard they work, couldn't just call person B and say, hey, they've been here 3 years without a raise. Inflation has gone up this much. They never complain. They're always here on time. Can we give them $1.50 more an hour? But no, no, like you could, okay, well, you got to go in this app, fill out this form, and then you have 7 layers of approval to get to that point where that person can get an extra $1.50 an hour. It's sorry it came out that way, but it's just something that's bothered me on the corporate level and on the governmental level for a long time, that like there's much hardness made where there does not need to be.
That's the government, right? That's what they're supposed to do. Sorry. Try to be lighthearted.
Can I just mention something? So my school, we have a $6.1 million budget. We got a 3% raise from the state with that House bill, which we got $183,000 increase. We lost 16 students because a lot of them are going to Missoula, which we just, because of the A and B formula, we just lost $128,000. And so our increase from the state was $55,000, which is not much. So, you know, I think, and even if you have, so when we look at the A and B, and I get the A and B formula, but we have to have a first grade, whether we have 14 kids or 20 kids. And especially being so close to Missoula, where, and you know, Corvallis has 2 charter schools, Missoula got 2. We're losing those kids, and I understand why, but we still have to have those classes and those teachers and books and a building that we have to support, like somebody said. I have a lot of issues with the A and B formula. You know, when we lose so much, when we lose kids, and now that our school will have to pay tuition. So if we have kids that live in the Florence district, they go to Victor, we have to pay tuition for those kids, which just takes that off our general budget. And it hurts those kids that live in the district, you know, looking for solutions, how to figure that out. But it's concerning.
And I think just to piggyback off the A and B thing, so as you guys all know, the A and B is calculated from the previous years. So then especially if you're a smaller school district and if you have one family move in with like 6 kids, that's a huge extra burden that's not taken into account until the next year. And then you could add more things onto it. Maybe they have a special needs kid that has an even extra expense on it. And there are some backstops there. But the A and B, I think, is definitely something that we could look at further of, like, I understand that being a component, you're right, because, you know, if you have makes sense if you have a lot of students that you get some money with that. But ways to balance that out and have it more, I guess, responsive to the needs of the school, whether it's a sudden drop or a sudden increase in students. So I know we're coming on to the 8 o'clock hour. So we've been here for an hour, and I think we've started to address some of the areas we want to get further in on. And I know I have some homework to get you guys, and I think it sounds like you guys be really interested in some of just where the money is coming from, right? So we obviously, it's like we could say the money comes from the state versus like the local tax levies or whatever. But I think you guys it sounds like you guys are very interested in like how much money is coming in from the different funding sources. So whether that be lumber or oil or lottery or whatever it is. So I think that will be one of my homework assignments, is to pull that. And are you guys getting bad echo back from feedback? I'm sorry. I'm going to do this real quick. Okay, that should be a little bit better, right? Okay, sorry, I should have done that earlier. I just feel silly wearing headphones when I'm by myself. So I think that's one of the things I'll pull for you guys, is kind of a breakdown of all of that and those calculations. But what other information are you guys interested? And I took notes, and I'll rewatch this to see what other things I can gather for you guys. But is there anything else that you guys have specific requests for me to get more data on?
Katie, I have one thought on this, is something you mentioned. Are there elements of what districts and schools have to do that cost money that are redundant and could be eliminated, and the funding of that elimination could be applied to something else that's more needed in the schools? So I don't know if you brought up OPI having to do all this gathering data and all that stuff. Is there anything that can be done to remove that from schools and still make schools accountable? But can we reduce that? Is there any part of the funding elements that can be reduced or eliminated that could use that money for other necessary resources?
I think that's definitely something we had to discuss more, of how we can reduce the administrative burden. And I know that's not necessarily doesn't have as much of a financial impact, but it does have an impact on that work-life balance that I think will help retain teachers and recruit teachers. They're there to interface with the students, not stare at a computer screen entering data. That's not why most teachers became teachers. So I know that there is some technology investments that the state has made to try to streamline some of that. I don't think it'll be a huge source of funding that could be diverted somewhere else. But let me just dig deeper into that and see if there's anything that when I'm talking to my colleagues that they see in that realm.
For me, I would like to know if there was, I mean, we're talking about like how can you generate funding without stealing from someone else, right? Or raising taxes. So I'd like to see if any other states or anything have creative ways like that. You know, what is the lottery that you pay, like the million lottery or whatever that sells out like that? Do you know, the $1 million, the Montana millions or something? Like, what if you did, like, that's a completely optional thing, right? What if you did a school funding, you know, several million, like something like that? Or I don't know, I was trying to think of something that was just totally different that a state does that isn't a tax burden on the taxpayers or stealing money from somebody else.
Now, do you know, in Montana, and I'm going to pull this, but money from the lottery is supposed to go to education. There's a lot of states that do that. Some other states do, and that's why I brought up the pot money or marijuana money. A sin tax, part of the sin tax goes directly to education. So, you know, we're talking about cigarettes and in some states weed, and then alcohol, things like that. So I do know there's some areas, and there's a number of great resources comparing states. And I'll put some of those in the resources links. Some of them are very high level, and it doesn't go into like what percentage of this tax goes there. But it might be a good thing for us to look at, because formulas are set up differently in every state. I mean, most states have something that kind of redistributes it, like our GTB ratio. But if it does make you feel any better, all states think their formula is broken. So we're not alone in that battle. And until a state finds like the perfect solution, we'll all be working to figure out what the right balance is of where we can get the money, how much money, and how we make sure that the money is being used in the best way to serve our students.
And if it's any consolation to any of you, having worked in corporate America through diverses of my entire career, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter. So if any of you are questioning your career path and what you've done because of the government and the federal regulations and all the loopholes you have to jump through, corporations, same thing. It doesn't matter. With that said, so the sustainability. So you said we have a surplus and that of course will not last forever, as all surpluses do not. However, the sustainability from what I've heard, and I do try to be solution based, and I will try to think of things after these meetings to help with that, doesn't seem like it's going in the right direction. Because if things are cracking and falling apart now when we have a surplus, and even though my kids aren't in public school, I'm concerned of what that future looks like if it's obviously not sustainable at what it is now with a surplus. What happens in 5 years if there isn't one? So I will do my research and my thinking and my reading and try to figure out where I might be able to come up with some out of the box ideas to help in that department, because this has been eye-opening, and it's I feel for everybody that's going through this on every level.
Just a little trivia, Katie, on the lottery. I believe when the lottery started, that money was supposed to go to education. But the
believe-
legislature
Yeah.
changed that.
Yep.
I think
They did.
Gary, and then when you see the advertisement that they advertise in the lottery, now they're saying it's going for STEM scholarships, which is a different situation than than our everyday educational system. Sitting through this meeting, one thing keeps popping into my mind, and it's something that I think we have to look at. The most damning situation and the most damning statement that you get in education is when you ask, why are you doing that? And the answer is, because that's the way we've always done it. That's your biggest problem. We've got to look at what can we do differently.
Agreed. And that's what I'm very hopeful for all these different groups, that like, yeah, big picture things, maybe tweaking some things there, but also just trying to think outside the box. And I appreciate everyone for trying to be creative. And also and Christina, I'm sorry you've heard this already, but I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of their very busy lives to be a part of this, number one. Number two, thank you for being a part of it. This is the first time OPI has done anything like this. So there is definitely a trial by error a little bit, but as Gary talked about, and as I talked about earlier, I think there's so much value in talking about these things, talking about them with each other, talking about them with legislators, talking about it early and often. So I think this is great. I hope OPI will continue this, whether I'm here or not in the future. But I think it's a great thing I think it's just a good incubator for ideas. So even if no one gets 100% their way, but even if we don't get 100% our way out of the legislature, I do think there's a lot of value in this discussion that we're having and the information we'll give the legislature. So if you guys have, I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on with the feedback, but if you guys have any questions that pop up, just email me and I'll try to do my best to find the information. I have a number of pieces of homework. I took a lot of notes. After I'm done with all the small group meetings this week, I will email you guys out to some notes that I took during this meeting. And then again, more resources and everything like that. And we'll continue this discussion. I think there was things that were raised in all the groups, and I'm hearing from a lot of people, inflation and teacher retention, but the 4 different funding formula tiers and all of that, those were new ideas that haven't come up in other groups. So we'll keep working on this, drilling it down, and I'll keep feeding you guys information, and I'm really excited of where this can go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great night, and I appreciate seeing everyone's faces.
Mhm.
Bye.
Bye.